When you hear a flute, what words come to mind? Light, airy. Try an oboe. Reedy. Maybe sultry? How about an alto sax? Colorful, maybe vibrant. Try a bassoon. Rumbly, bouncy. How about a bass clarinet? Sonorous, resonant. And let's also do a clarinet. Vocal, pitched. What I'm describing is the timbre of an instrument, spelled Timbre, which embarrassingly I've been pronouncing as timbre for my entire life, which is really hard to say in a room full of musicians.
So timbre is what sound sounds like.
Clear as
right?
mud.
I know. So like the quality, the character of the sound, the aspects of the experience of your sound. You have a physical sound out there in the world, the acoustical signal, and then you have what you perceive. So timbre is about what you perceive and your experience of that sound.
That's Lindsey Reymore. She's an assistant professor of music theory in the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. Her work focuses on timbre, which she calls tone color, or even the flavor of music. It's why a trumpet and a violin sound different, even when they're playing the same note. And yet, for something so essential to how we experience music, it's the musical dimension we know the least about.
It's the hardest to talk about, and because of that, it's been the least researched, and it's not even usually talked about in music theory classrooms.
So Reymore set out to do something ambitious, build a scientific understanding of how we talk about timbre. From Arizona State University, this is Lab Coat Optional, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm your host, Pete Zrioka, and today, what sound sounds like and why it might be easier to describe than you think. Lindsey, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to talk. I'm actually very nervous to talk to you today, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because I am functionally musically illiterate. I mean, I enjoy music. Like, I can tell you about music, but like in terms of like the technical aspects of music, I feel like I'm more clueless about this than I am about like astrophysics.
Well, I think you probably know more than you think you do because you've been listening to music your whole life, right?
That's true. I have been.
Yeah.
But I've also been listening to the same music for like 20 years. Like it's still like pop punk emo from like high school.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's actually, it's very common. People like to listen to what they listen to in high school. That's there's a term called the reminiscence bump.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's not just Arrested
It's
Development?
not just you.
Okay, cool. That's good to know.
Yeah.
I'm very glad.
Yeah, but I don't know. I hear that a lot. And I think that people often feel like, oh, I don't have the technical wherewithal to talk about music. But you are a music listener and a music lover. So you know more than you think you do. And your experience is valuable, right?
Well, that puts me a little at ease. Okay, great. So, all right, timbre is the characteristic of sound. That's how sound sounds. Let's do some Music 101 here. How does timbre, I almost said timbre again. How does timbre differentiate from other qualities of music like pitch or rhythm?
Yeah, so pitch is the kind of sensation of how high or low something sounds, right?
Okay.
And then you have rhythm where, well, you have a beat, which is the thing you tap your foot to when you're listening to music. And rhythm is kind of patterns over time in relation to that beat that we perceive, and it's a temporal type of thing.
Okay.
And pitch is high and low, and then timbre is the kind of color or the flavor.
Okay. Oh, flavor.
Yeah,
okay,
like
now we're
yeah.
getting more and more esoteric. All right, so timbre is how sound sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Pitch is how high or low that sound is.
Mm-hmm.
And then rhythm is pretty much how often you play the sound, or like when the sound is played.
When the sound, yeah.
Okay, so how and when.
We have like maybe the dimension of up and down, the dimension of time, and then this color dimension.
More
color,
nebulous
flavor.
one.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely the most nebulous, and it's the hardest to talk about. And because of that, it's been the least researched, and it's not even usually talked about in music theory classrooms. So this is kind of one of my long-term goals is I'm doing the research to learn more about this, and then how can we bring that into the music theory classroom for people who are studying music in universities.
I want to pause on that real quick. Okay, so obviously when you're training to become a musician, you learn what timbre is. And it just kind of stops there.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it's interesting because as musicians and as performers, we think about timbre all the time. I mean, I think a lot of musicians really want that. They want their tone to be really, really good and expressive and have just the right kind of color to it. And yet we don't spend time thinking in classes about how to talk about it or practicing how to like efficiently communicate with each other. So, and it's something that happens. I mean, especially in music lessons, like one-on-one individual lessons where you're maybe have a student and they're sounding a certain way and you want them to sound a different way. You know, how do you communicate that? Well, yeah, you can play and you can demonstrate, but it's good to also have
the
that
vernacular
toolbox
for it.
of words.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in addition to musicology, you incorporate behavioral psychology and signal processing. I would like to define how those interface with your work, because signal processing is something that I thought related to electronics. So please explain.
Okay. So a lot of my methods in how I do research come from those things.
Okay.
In terms of psychology, so I've done like interviews, basically different kinds of ratings and judgment tasks. So we do a lot of participants will come in and we play them different sounds and ask them questions about the sounds, essentially, very basically. And then the signal processing, because the sound is, we can think of it as an acoustic signal. And that is a sort of different area of research where I'm interested in trying to understand how what's the sound that's out there in the world that we can kind of measure objectively, how does that map onto timbre is that perceptual side of things, right?
Right.
So we get timbre when there's a brain to process the sound out there in the world. And we can use kind of signal processing techniques to be able to do the calculations and try to connect those two things. But it turns out it's there are things that we know, and but a lot of it's really messy because perception is also varies from person to person.
For sure, yeah.
It has all sorts of other things that affect it, like culture and training, and so it's a fun can of worms.
Okay. Well, it sounds like
Yeah.
it. You specifically did 2 studies related to timbre. And in the first, I think it was in 2020 and 2021, if I recall correctly. First, you interviewed musicians to create what you called timbre trait profiles, which, again, describe what the sound like, right? The character of musical instruments.
Yes. So the first part of it was just getting people to talk about their conceptions of different musical instrument sounds and figuring out what is the language people are using, what kind of strategies do people use to describe sound, and then from there coming up with this model. So this model had like 20 dimensions or 20 categories. So categories like rumbling and low, or brassy, or soft and singing and sweet.
Okay.
And then so I've got 20 categories. And then the second study, we wanted to create these kinds of like instrumental personality maps. So we used that 20-dimensional model and had people rate a bunch of instruments using the model. And then we come up with these kind of, I call them thumbprints, right, of the different instruments, kind of an average perception of what that instrument's character is.
Thumbprint is useful because then you can find out when a tuba killed someone. In the first study, the first part of the first study, you had musicians imagine the sounds, right? Why did you have them imagine instead of going to recording right away?
Right. So we kind of have two options. If we want people to describe sound, we could come in and play them a recording, or we could ask them, imagine the sound. And for the purpose of making these personality thumbprints, we wanted to capture the prototypical, the kind of stereotype of an instrument. And one way of getting at that would be to have people imagine. The first thing that comes to your head is going to be sort of that prototype.
Sure.
Right. And there's research that suggests that musicians who have experience with particular instruments are going to be able to imagine those sounds vividly enough. Right. And that's different than if I play one particular sound, there are going to be things about that particular sound that might not represent what would be a prototypical sound.
Right. So, okay, was there anything surprising that emerged from this first round of interviews, like about how the musicians characterized timbre of different instruments?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense, because I had the background as a performing musician, there weren't that many surprises because I know how I think about timbre, and I've heard people, when we do talk about it. But I think the niftiest thing was just how diversely people approach the task, how creatively, like how much creativity there is in thinking of strategies to describe sound, the kind of rich vocabulary that people use. And I think the funniest thing is, because this is not something that's practiced or taught or done very regularly, I would debrief people after the interviews and I would say, how did you find this task? And they'd say, oh, that was so hard. I've never done this before. Like, it was really hard to think of words. And I'm just laughing to myself because I'm going, you just talked for an hour and a half and I didn't have to do anything.
Really?
They came up with things, but they expressed that it felt like...
It felt difficult.
It felt difficult.
Even though you got really good results from them. Huh. Well, do you think that is due to training and like the intimacy people have with these instruments, or like...
So I think it's part of it.
Okay.
I think particularly for the imagined sounds,
Sure.
that they had to have that kind of intimacy with all these different instruments. But, playing people recorded sounds is, even if they don't have the musical training, you get similar results. I often, if I'm, explaining to someone who doesn't have musical training what I do, I'll have them like imagine the sound of their favorite singer and then describe it, and they can do it really well. And then they might often say the same thing, like, oh, I'm not really sure what to say, but then they do it and they do it really well.
Okay.
So
I'm like sitting here trying to think of how I'd describe my favorite singers, and like, I guess I have some ideas, but like also we're not going to try it. This first part of that study, I found this interesting. A lot of the musicians had personal anecdotes that you didn't include in the categories because, they're pretty arbitrary. But I was curious if you could tell me about some of those personal experiences they shared with you. Were they relating the instruments to memories, to pieces of music, to media? Like, I'm so curious to hear the stuff you didn't use, but I would imagine was probably pretty fascinating. Yeah.
So the model, the dimensions that went into the model were the things that were most common that people would say most frequently.
Yeah.
And that ended up being mostly like adjectives, right? But then they had all these idiosyncratic experiences that they would bring in. Maybe an instrument reminded them of a piece or a particular kind of experience in their life, or they associate it with one musician. They're saying like, oh, I'm hearing the sound of Miles Davis or something like that. But there are also these really idiosyncratic descriptions, really unique and weird, these metaphors people came up with. So one of them, I remember, she was describing a snare drum.
A snare drum, okay.
Yeah, the one, you hit it, like they're in marching bands and things like that. Yeah. And she goes, ants. Like, why am I thinking about ants? And she kind of thinks about it and goes, okay. And she goes, oh, it's the feeling you get when you crush an ant in a Kleenex.
Oh, wow.
That's what it sounds like.
That's way darker than I thought she was going to take that.
And then she goes, she kind of went, oh, that's horrible.
But I know exactly what she means.
That's exactly it, right? It's like this super vivid language. Yeah. And as people come up with these metaphors, then they kind of like dive into it and try to figure out why do I think that way? And with the snare, that kind of like crunch is in the sound. It's the snares in the snare drum. There's like this noise.
Yeah.
And it's very kinesthetic. And so she goes, yeah, I really like the sound of the snare drum. I don't like how it feels. But yeah, the metaphor works.
She doesn't like how it feels to crush an ant.
Correct.
But, okay.
Yeah. Like she's very much wanted to let me know that she's not a fan of crushing ants.
I mean, yeah, that's a...
But the metaphor worked. And then there was another person, I think they were talking about the bass drum. And he's like, yeah, it kind of reminds me of like a chubby black bear.
A chubby black bear.
You know, maybe the furriness has to do with, because you hit a bass drum with this big mallet and it's got this big furry thing. So he kind of said, I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking of the furry mallet. He goes, no, it's like there's this kind of roundness to the sound and it's got furry edges, and it's a bear and it's kind of endearing, but also you got to be careful because bears can be powerful and dangerous even though they're cute.
That has layers.
And yeah, and that all of that description he was pulling out of like, oh, this is what I'm hearing in the bass drum sound. Right, here's the associations I have with this instrument. See,
I feel like that could only come from musicians. I mean, and again, I'm approaching this from my perspective. I feel like if you played certain instruments for me, I would just like immediately relate them to media. It's like, oh, a cello.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, it's like the Angel theme, man. Like that was a great theme.
Yeah. Oh, people do that. And I wouldn't say not everybody I interviewed had these elaborate metaphors.
Those are good ones.
Those are really good ones. Yeah. So different people have different strategies and tend to use different approaches. So some people just listed adjectives. Some people were really into the associations. Some of them got really poetic, like I was just describing. Yeah. And I think that has there's a lot of individual variability among everybody with how we use language. For sure. Anyway. So think of like, I don't know, a flute.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, might be...
whimsical.
Yeah, whimsical, airy, breathy. What else?
Elven?
Elven?
I don't know.
I like it. Yeah. These kinds
I think of like fairies when I think of a flute, you know? Maybe like Pan, or just... Maybe Fantasia. I don't know where I'm getting that.
There's a lot of associations. Well, what if we gave you a flute sound and you could tell us what else you're hearing?
You're going to test me live.
I'm going to test you live.
This is we
give you a couple of sounds.
Okay,
and
I would be game to try that. We'll get set up for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Lindsay, you got 3 samples for me?
I do.
Hit me.
All right. Well, let's start with the flute since you just described that. Let's see if you can come up with any other descriptors there.
You said airy. Airy comes to mind for that one. Again, I'm thinking whimsical. I'm thinking woodland.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Goes with the elves and the fairies.
Yeah,
right?
that goes back to the elves and the fairies again. Can you play it again for me? Yeah, very light. It's light. It's I can't think of the word right now, but like I think like atmosphere and atmospheric maybe? I don't know. Yeah, like I'm going to stick with elven. Yeah,
but it's interesting, even just the gesture you made, right? That has meaning in it, too. I
was reaching up.
That has some sort of meaning you're trying to express from what you're feeling in that sound.
Yeah.
And that's not even words, right? So there are other ways beyond words that we can describe.
That's true, yeah.
That we can express what we're hearing. Okay, now how about I give you 2 other instruments? I'm not going to tell you what they are.
Okay.
Just give me sound qualities, and then if you want, you can guess what they are.
The first word that comes to mind is reedy. You know, I'm thinking, I think of, for some reason, I think of like grass or bamboo. One more time. I would say pitched and reedy.
Yeah, good, great. Do you know what instrument it was? It's actually really challenging just from a single note often to identify instruments.
See, this is where my music illiteracy is really biting me. I'm thinking, it's a woodwind. No, woodwind is all the ones you blow, right?
Yeah.
Okay, see. An oboe? No. What's the other one that looks kind of like an oboe?
That's it, clarinet.
Yes, that one.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but reedy. You said reedy. It has a reed.
Okay.
Right, it's a reed instrument. So.
Oh.
Yeah, so I was curious if you'd... Good job.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Ooh. I mean, this is a dumb description for a sound, but it's sonorous, you know?
How is that a dumb... That's a great description for a sound.
That's how a sound is. It's sonorous. There's a tinge of rumble to it. One more time for me. Kind of melancholy too. Almost funereal. I don't know. It's a bit of a sad noise. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a cello.
Oh, it is a cello.
Yeah.
I love the cello.
So, I mean, it has a reputation for playing those like soulful, melodious, sonorous.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm so curious how my answers lined up with what you found in the study. Like,
yeah, so you did a great job.
oh, great. Oh man.
But yeah, a lot of the words are those are words that other people use, right? A lot of those words are words that were common enough to end up in that model. So, reedy is in there in the kind of first set of descriptions, not necessarily in the final model, but melancholy was definitely in there, and reedy, and a lot of the terms, light for the flute, airy.
But so the way these instruments are described, and there's similarities among them, right? Does that come down more to our shared perception of things, or do you think that is more standardized thinking as a result of like musical training?
Yeah, so I think there are probably some sorts of commonalities that we have with how we're perceiving sound. So there's a tendency that I suspect is probably pretty common across cultures to describe sound in terms of the characteristics of the thing that made the sound.
Yeah.
So whether it's woody or metallic, or, some characteristic is the thing making the sound like big or small, right? So those may be more common, but culture and training play a really big role in the kinds of language that we use, because we learn those terms even implicitly. Like I said, we don't really explicitly teach them in the classroom, but people will pick up on them just from descriptions, conversations, things like that.
So when you built these timbre trait, I said timbre, right? I keep catching myself.
No, you're fine.
When you built these timbre trait profiles and then you made the thumbprints for all the instruments, were you surprised about how consistently they were kind of described and how much agreement there was among musicians?
Yeah. Again, I think just being a musician, no.
Okay.
But it's surprising in a way, because I think I mentioned earlier that this parameter of music, timbre, has not been studied very well, and partially because scholars would say, oh, this thing is too vague. These metaphors about ants and Kleenexes, we can't have that. Like, right? That's too weird.
Yeah.
It's too out there. But I think what my research and other research in the area has demonstrated is that people actually do have some consistency. And you can see it within, how people agreed on how to use terms, but also you look at these thumbprints and, all the string instruments, the violin, the viola, the cello, they have similarities. The different kinds of saxophones all kind of look similar. And, the soprano saxophone has a bit of a different take to it than a baritone saxophone. But they've got these kind of core things in common.
So you mentioned that there hasn't been a lot of study in timbre. Do you think it is just because it is so out there, or characterizes out there? Like you said, we can't have the ant in a Kleenex analogy in music education. Or is there other reasons that people just haven't approached this? Yeah,
I think one of the reasons is that it has a reputation for being really hard to describe.
Okay.
And then another part of it is the psychoacoustics of it, meaning the relationship between the things out there in the world and the psychology of what's going on in our mind and our ability to connect those things and understand how they connect. It's really complex. And so kind of in order to be able to model some of that, the math to do that, and then also having people come along and say, oh, okay, let's actually use this math to try and solve this problem. That really didn't start happening until 1977 is the kind of big seminal paper where people started looking at timbre from a psychoacoustical point of view. I would say really since 2018, 2020 is when there's a huge surge of interest in timbre. So it's getting more and more common. There's a lot more research now than there was 8-10 years ago.
So it's fair to call this kind of an emerging area of interest.
Absolutely,
in music. It's weird that the first thing came in 1977 because we've been playing musical instruments for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, well, and people have talked about it before.
Sure.
So Helmholtz talks
Sure.
about timbre.
I don't know who that is.
Back in the 1800s.
Okay, old dude.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And he did like a kind of acoustics and he talks about timbre, and other people, other thinkers have discussed this in their writings and things like that, but not in a systematic way. And music theory as the field that exists in North America today as a discipline is really focused on pitch and on harmony and chords and scales and things like that. And so that's been just a really big focus. And timbre has often been considered to be like decorative or ornamental, or it's just color. It's just the icing on the cake. It's not really that important. But it actually, it is really important for how we experience sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about applicability of this research. You suggested that these profiles could be used for music theory, teaching music, and more perceptual research. Can you tell me a little bit more about each of those areas and how you see this work being applied there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I would love to see it incorporated more commonly in the music theory classroom. I think that it is part of the education for people who are majoring in music or just interested in learning more, that learning how to talk about sound color will be really helpful in practice, kind of feeling confident. So like I said, people can do it. Yeah. They're good at it.
Yeah.
But they don't feel confident about it. And it doesn't take much to just give them, here's a little set of tools, let's practice. Sure. And then all of a sudden they're actually a lot better at it.
Right.
So I think that can be very helpful. It can help us understand music, to analyze music, and learn kind of new things about it. So there are some music like the romantic orchestral tradition where they use all sorts of different instruments like the ones in the profiles. And that music has traditionally been analyzed in terms of its harmony, right, in terms of its form. But I look at it and go, well, what about this color? And how does the color interact with the form and interact with the harmony to tell a unique story? Yeah. So those are the kind of performance, the humanities implications, but there's also a lot in there of just like, how are we using language to describe our perception?
We mentioned culture a few times, right? I wanted to know how culturally specific the model that you created was because, well, first of all, where were all the musicians from that you interviewed?
Yeah, so they were all North American musicians in a very, all in the sort of traditional classical practice. They, either were at a university or conservatory, or they had graduated from one. So there's, there's probably a specific vocabulary that gets developed among a certain culture. And then it also has to do with what the instruments are that they're describing, right? So there's a certain world of sound in an orchestra that's very different than the world of sound in like pop music or even within different genres of pop music. Think of all the different sound colors in metal versus like hip hop. Yeah. Or, more like 80s pop. Right. Right.
Well,
so
it's because I was wondering, like, can we apply this type of model to other schools of instruments? I don't even know. Families of instruments?
One thing I have done recently is a similar interview type study, but with a solo voice. And so those were actually, we played recordings of different singers and had people describe them. And those singers came from different pop genres. So it included R&B, hip hop, opera, musical theater, jazz, and I think one or two more.
Huge range. Okay.
Yeah, like trying to get a really big range of different kinds of voices, different genders. And what was actually the most interesting to me about that is there were very few new words. So it still was the same participant group. We're still looking at people with musical training in North America. But there were very few kind of new ideas. Like the words were still used in a similar way. So I do think that there will be differences if we're looking at different populations, people speaking different languages, different musical traditions, if they're responding maybe to instruments that are different than the ones used in the original study. But I also think there's just going to be a lot of the same words that tend to come up.
Well, when you said that a lot of the same words came up for voices, that one surprised me and then made me wonder if, like, is that just a limitation of English, though? Like, do we not have the words to describe?
Well, I think those limitations are part of the reason that people go off and find the elaborate metaphors about the chubby black bears and the Kleenexes and the ants. Again, that will also be a common tactic. But there's also a limitation to how we could use language to describe anything, really.
Sure, yeah. I mean, like, I was describing things physically before I did anything. Yeah. Theoretically, if you ran the study in, like, Southeast Asia or Western Africa, what do you think might change, if anything?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm hoping to do that, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Specifically those places or somewhere else?
So the study is going to focus on language.
Okay.
Really hard to disentangle language and culture.
Yeah.
So the study will focus on language, and I have an initial version of the project. So it's going to be funded by the Institute for Social Sciences Research at ASU. I have a seed grant for that. And I have a team of researchers from different universities who are native speakers of 10 different languages.
Okay.
And right at this point, a lot of those languages are related because they're collaborators who are in Europe. So we have Spanish and French and Italian and English and German, right? But we're going to start the small version of a study, and we're going to pick 6 languages and kind of run the same study. Same exact study, same exact sounds, 6 different languages, and then compare the results. And then the idea is we would need more resources to be able to go and, find collaborators and collect data in places like Southeast Asia. So if we start with some really interesting findings with what we have as a starting place, then hopefully we can get funding to go kind of expand this. But yeah, I think that there will be a lot of similarities, and I think that there will also be some very interesting cultural differences.
Will you be using the same instruments? Okay. Yeah. So I want to call orchestral instruments limited, but there's a lot more instruments in the world. Yes. So is there any plans to look at different instruments and try that's what
for this study, it would be not just the orchestral. We might only use a few of those.
Right.
We haven't totally decided on what we're going to use, but probably different instruments from around the world. Maybe also some sounds that are not instrument sounds, but just other types of everyday timbres. You have a car horn or a door creaking or waterfall or something, right? Those also have sound qualities.
They do, yeah. Well, that was kind of one of my wrap-up questions is, like, do you ever catch yourself characterizing the timbre of just, like, a door creaking or your car starting or, I don't know, a garbage bin lid slamming shut, Yeah.
I think since this is now what I spend a lot of time studying, I pay attention to sound a lot.
Okay.
And to the kind of effect it has or the qualities of it, for sure. And I think when I listen to music, it's a very, very colorful experience because I'm paying attention to those sorts of things. So even if I'm not thinking about it in terms of language, I'm attending to it in a different way because I have spent a lot of time describing it and thinking about it.
I'm a very words forward person. So, like, the parts of music that I've always gravitated to most is, like, lyrics. And if I just want background noise, I'll put on instrumental music, but I don't really pay attention to instrumental music when I'm listening to it. So when you say you have a colorful experience when you're listening to music, can you describe that for me a little more? Like, are you literally closing your eyes? Like, how what do you mean colorful? I have no idea what you mean.
I pay attention to the different characters of the sounds and how they interact. So the musical texture, so, you have, a lot of times you'll have like a bass line and then there's a melody and then maybe there's instruments playing harmony, right? So if it were in a pop group, you might have electric bass and some sort of synthesizer, piano, and then the vocalist, right? And so each of those layers has a different quality, and they are going to interact with each other. And then also when you switch from one part of the music to another part of the music, so what we call the musical form. Mm-hmm. So in pop music, like you have a verse and you have a chorus and you have a bridge. So each one of those sections also tends to have unique combinations of instruments and unique combinations of colors. And so I hear those things. I like pay attention to those things.
I'm probably thinking of this too literally, but have you seen Ratatouille? You've seen Ratatouille. Oh, yeah. Okay. You know when Remy's describing like flavor to his stupid brother?
Yep.
And like there's like the swirling colors in the air. And he's like, oh, the lightness of the strawberry combined with like...
Yeah, I think that's a great description. Yes.
Okay, not too literal then.
No, not at all. And
right.
I used the word flavor before for timbre, and I think absolutely, like you can think of it as flavor and as food metaphor. I actually have a colleague who that's his big thing when he's talking about timbre is he has food metaphors.
He has food metaphors. Yeah. Can you give me one of these food metaphors? I'm so curious.
Oh gosh. I don't know. I can't think of a particular one.
I think horn instruments are like cheesy.
Cheesy.
Not in a that's cringe way, but like in a
what kind of cheese? There's so many different kinds of cheese.
Like a funky cheese.
Oh, okay.
Like a blue cheese or like...
Okay, yeah. Now, so when you initially said cheese, I was thinking like cheddar. I'm like, I don't know if I see that. But now you say blue.
It's too bright acidic. I'm thinking like a funky cheese.
Yeah.
Like
it's got
a fromage.
Right. It's got that kind of like pungent or piercingness to it that when you have...
That lingers.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah.
That flavorful resonance. See, now you're getting into these metaphors. This is perfect.
I mean... Lindsey, thank you for coming on the show. I've learned a lot and also discovered that maybe I'm better at music than I thought I was.
I think that's right.
One thing that I like to ask people at the end of the show is if someone wants to learn more about what we talked about today, timbre, music theory, whatever, do you have some reading or watching or maybe particularly for you, listening recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, so... before I came to Arizona State, I was at McGill University for 2 years doing a postdoc position with the ACTOR project, which is the analysis, creation, and teaching of orchestration.
Okay.
And so one of the big kind of products from that grant was the timbre and orchestration resource. Okay. So if you want to go learn more about timbre, you can go online to it's the TOR, the timbre and orchestration resource, and there's all sorts of different kinds of projects that have been done. There's a section that's like learn about timbre for the curious beginner, right? So there's more there. So I would recommend that as a resource.
Excellent.
For listening, if you're interested in thinking about the different instrument characters, have you ever listened to Peter and the Wolf? You know Peter and the Wolf? Okay. No. It's great. It's a piece by Prokofiev that's... an orchestral piece, but it's a story.
Okay.
So there's a narration. Okay. And the narrator tells the story, and each character in the story is represented by a different instrument. So it's, the cat is the clarinet. Oh. The grandfather is the bassoon. The oboe is the duck, which... it's like a little offensive, but also not entirely incorrect.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I think going back to listen to that if you've already heard it or listening to it for the first time, it's really fun. It's good for the kids.
Yeah.
it's a good story.
Very cool.
So, yeah.
I will put those recommendations in the show notes. Lindsey, thank you again for coming on the show. This was super fascinating. And yeah, I feel a lot better coming out of this interview. Great. Well, and thank you for sharing your descriptions with me. I always love hearing how people describe sounds. So will you ever think of a flute as anything other than elven? Nope, that's it. That's all I got from now on. It's fine. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, so I'm good. Like, I put my stamp on the timbre trait profiles. I'm good glad. Job. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for tuning in, and special thanks to the Ocotillo Winds from the School of Music, Dance, and Theater for performing our theme. They are Assistant Professor Jeff Anderley on bass clarinet, Professor Elizabeth Buck on flute, Professor Christopher Creviston on alto saxophone, Assistant Professor Jonathan Davis on oboe, Associate Professor Josh Gardner on clarinet, and Professor Albie Miklish, the best dressed bassoonist in the biz. Stay tuned after the credits to hear them play an arrangement of Igor Stravinsky's Galop. And a huge thank you to our guest, Assistant Professor Lindsey Reymore, for coordinating their performance. Lab Coat Optional is a production of the Strategic Marketing and Communications team at Knowledge Enterprise at Arizona State University. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. If you enjoyed the show, leave a funny comment or a funny 5-star review. You can roast me. If you make me laugh, I'll read it out on the show. And if you found us on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. As always, lab coats are optional for this show. We want all our researchers to stay safe in the lab, so wear your PPE. Until next time, stay curious. That was awesome. That was so fun.